I know why I'm going to garden this year, and after a couple weeks of planning, I now know what I'm going to grow this season. Now it's time to figure out how I'm going to grow and where I'm going to grow my garden. Join me today on a cold Colorado morning as I discuss garden planning in winter. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and what I'm going to do now is give you a real-time demonstration of how I plan my garden on a cold winter's day. It's 12 degrees Fahrenheit right now, that's minus 11 Celsius, and it's on days like today that I actually like getting out in my garden and walking around and figuring out how I'm going to do it this year. Many of you gave me ideas of what plants I should grow this year, and I've been spending the last few days ordering seed packets to put them in the ground. Well, now I've got to figure out where all of those seeds are going to go. And some of those seeds will be started into plants. Where am I going to put those plants? So join me as I do a tour and an observation in my garden, trying to figure out the best spot for all of those new plants this year. This is my primary vegetable garden area. I have a lot more space off to the side, and I'll definitely be using that much more this year. In these beds, this is typically where I grow my squash, my peppers, my garlic, and some tomatoes. This bed already has the garlic in place, so I'm not going to be doing anything with this bed, at least for most of the gardening season. Over there where Mala is, that's my hugelkultur bed, and this is where I normally grow my pumpkins, some zucchinis, and other squashes. But this year, mainly because of your suggestions, I'm going to be growing a lot of melons. So instead of putting the pumpkins and the squash here this year, I think I'm going to turn this into a melon patch. With the garlic in this bed, let's start at this one. Now, this is where I've grown tomatoes for the last couple years. And while I don't rotate my crops and I do regular amending, I think I'm going to do something different in this bed this year, not tomatoes. I haven't grown squash in this bed ever, so this will probably be the bed that I grow some of those new squash varieties that you all have recommended. Now in this bed, I've had a variety of things over the last few years. I currently have the top sticking through the soil of some cabbage, some Napa cabbage that did really well in my garden. I left the plants in the ground over the winter so that they'll set seed this year. The cabbage is a biennial plant, so I have to leave it in the ground to get seeds the next year. So I am limited in what I can grow in this bed because the middle is made up of those cabbage plants. So I'll probably do some carrots and radishes in this bed, some of those new varieties. Maybe I'll do radishes on the south end, and I'll do carrots on this north end. And so I'm off to a pretty good start. I've already got 3 of these 6 beds figured out. What I'll do as the next step in this process is take this basic information of where I think I'm going to put the plants, and then I'll enter it into my planter planning app to actually figure out how many of the plants I'm going to put in each of the beds, which varieties are going to go in which rows, and try to become a little more specific as to which plants are growing in which beds. But I need to get back to the other beds and figure out what I'm going to do with them. I like growing peppers in at least one of the beds in this section of my garden. I've done that each year. And so this bed gets the most sun. It's never shaded by my shed. So I'm going to put some pepper plants in this bed. I also have a lot of squashes on my list this year. I've grown squash in this bed for the last couple years, but the soil's been amended. I'm not worried about having to rotate the crop, but I've got enough squash that I have to grow as part of my overall plan. I think I'll do both of these beds with different types of squash plants. This big area of my garden is primarily made for growing tomatoes and peppers. And I'll still do that again this year, but I think I'll switch the beds a little bit. Last year, I grew tomatoes in this whole row. I've done that for a couple years now. I think I'll go ahead and change this row to some peppers, and I'll also do some melons. I think that I'll trellis up the fence just like I trellis my tomatoes, and then I'll end up growing tomatoes in the back area of this section. I grew a few tomatoes on this back side, but for the most part, this is where I grew my peppers, and I also had some squashes in the back corner. This year, especially since this is the south side and this fence gets full sun during the day, I'm going to make this an entire row of tomatoes. This is my pepper bed. It did great growing peppers this year. I've got some dwarf tomatoes and some determinate tomatoes I'll be growing this year. And so I think this will be a good bed for those smaller tomato plants. In the first year, I did try growing some indeterminate tomatoes, but once I get the shade cloth at the top here, that's just not enough room for those tomatoes. So I think this makes more sense to have smaller plants. In the back corner, I've just been growing sunflowers and some native flowers. I'm not sure if I'm going to have to open this up to vegetable garden plants. That's where the planning app comes in. If I can fit all of the plants I'm planning to grow in all of these other beds, then I may not need to plant everything in the vegetable garden. For now, I think we're moving forward with a pretty good plan. I do have this north bed. This is where I grew all of my paste tomatoes this last year. And so this will be kind of the spillover. If I don't have enough room in the other beds for the peppers and the squash and the melons and the tomatoes, this will be the bed that I stick those plants in. I'm not going to figure this one out for now. This will be my fallback when I figure out that I don't have enough space for everything I want. So that's the bulk of my vegetable garden, already figured out. Now, this plan is not set in concrete, but usually when I come out on a day like today and I do the initial plan for where I'm going to put the plants, it holds pretty true. So you could probably expect to see in future videos that the plants I mentioned that I'm going to be sticking in these beds is probably going to end up being what you see going into the rest of the growing season. I've got one more space to try to figure out, and I'm not sure exactly which direction I'm leaning as I get to my greenhouse. I have my in-ground bed here in the greenhouse, and I've also moved in some of my rosemary plants. Now, I think I will probably do some more plants in pots in the greenhouse in the next season. I'll be taking more advantage of this bench to grow some of those potted plants. Mostly herbs. I'm planning to do a lot of teas and medicinal concoctions this year. Those will probably be growing on the bench. But in the ground, I do have a fig tree in this corner, and then I also have a fig tree in this other corner. So that's going to limit me to a certain degree. This is where I had my black cherry tomato growing last year, and it grew so well that it actually shaded out this fig tree and stunted its growth a little bit. I think I might do a single indeterminate tomato right here in the middle of this bed, and then that opens up the space between that plant and the fig tree, going in both directions. I'm really not sure what I'm going to do, so I'm going to leave this as kind of a question mark, and again get to the planning app, figure out if there's a plant that has no other location, and it may end up going right there. And so my garden is essentially planned. I have a pretty good idea of which plants are going to go in which beds. It's not any more specific than that right now as to the exact varieties in the very specific beds, but that'll be coming soon. The why this year is experimentation for me. I'm trying new varieties, and I want to try to find some new plants that become favorites of mine in the years ahead. The what, the plants I'm growing, came from a long list that many of you recommended. And so I ordered more than 50 seed packets that will be coming in the next couple weeks. So I was able to have a general idea of a bed that's going to grow squash in it, or a different bed that's going to grow peppers. The next phase of the planning will be identifying very specific varieties and then deciding which beds they go into and where in that bed I'll be putting those plants. So after a brief interruption from the Canadian geese, I'm going to go inside and start that process. As you've probably figured out, I'm cold, I'm chilled, and I need to go in and get warm and continue with my garden planning. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.